can you introduce yourself and tell us who you are?
Okay. I'm Adrian Benepe, President and CEO of Brooklyn Botanic Garden and former New York City Parks Commissioner under Mayor Bloomberg from 2002 to 2012.
And you've been involved with parks like your whole career, right? You started as an urban park ranger, in their first year in 1979. Can you talk about that and why did you get involved with them?
Yeah, I've been involved with parks since I was a teenager. It's little known fact is my first job at the Parks Department was in the summer of 1973 as what they call a seasonal park helper. I was picking up garbage and cleaning locker rooms and toilets on the Lower East Side, including East River Park. Then right out of college, I got a job as a park ranger in the first urban park ranger program, started by then Parks Commissioner Gordon Davis. And then that led to a career at the Parks Department that included being in charge of art and antiquities, natural resources, forestry and horticulture. I was Manhattan Borough Commissioner for 6 years and then Parks Commissioner for 11 years under Mayor Bloomberg.
What got you interested in working in parks?
You know, people often ask me if I have a landscape architecture or botany or city planning degree, and none of the above. Academically, I was never qualified to be Parks Commissioner, but I grew up in New York City. The parks were my backyard, especially Riverside Park and Central Park, and just became interested in parks and the environment. I always thought I was going to be a reporter and journalist, but ended up making a career in parks and the outdoors.
And we talk about you as Parks Commissioner, and I came here to talk about the Elmhurst gas tanks, but besides the Elmhurst gas tanks, there was a lot of programs that you were involved in, like the High Line, right, and the Brooklyn Bridge Park. Those are very popular, amazing places now. Can you reflect on those a little bit?
Well, we were, the park system in New York is one of the biggest and most important in the world. It's certainly the biggest. Not the biggest size-wise, but the most complex one in America. And it's always been very important to New York. Effectively, the urban park model was invented in New York City, especially at Central Park, and that led to many other cities transforming themselves with parks. So we've been a great city of parks for many years. It's also been extremely uneven. We've had boom years and bust years. And the park system that I first encountered as a teenage worker in the 1970s was devastated. It was terrible, it was full of crime, everything was broken. Central Park and Prospect Park were ruins, literally. And it was hard to imagine them getting better. And then later, I got to both witness and participate in a renaissance of the park system, and then the biggest expansion of the park system since the 1930s and Robert Moses and the WPA, which took place under Mike Bloomberg. And yes, other mayors did a lot of good setup work. People forget that Brooklyn Ridge Park and Hudson River Park started under Mayor Giuliani and Governor Pataki. They made very big, bold decisions to add major new parks, so you have to give them credit. Henry Stern was a grand acquisitor who added lots and lots of parkland. But we brought to fruition in the Bloomberg administration many ideas that were in the pipeline. So things like the High Line, we put in hundreds of millions of dollars into Brooklyn Bridge Park and Hudson River Park, did major regional parks as part of Plan YC, added 1 million trees, did parks along the Brooklyn and Queens waterfront, improved parks along the West Side waterfront. So it was the biggest period of park expansion and development since the WPA in the 1930s. We were spending about $500 million a year every year for 12 years. So we spent about $6 billion transforming Fresh Kills landfill into a park, building big new destination parks in Far Rockaway, in southern Brooklyn, in the South Bronx. $200 million went into improving the Bronx River corridor as a park and greenery thing. So no corner of the city was left untouched during this second golden age of parks.
Robert Moses did take a lot of spaces like the Elmhurst site, like the Elmhurst gas tanks, and made it into a park. But a lot of his parks exist now, and they're just asphalt, and so. Can you talk about maybe the challenges of maybe Moses gave us a space, but a lot of people don't use it for various reasons because, it's either not interesting or it seems unsafe. Or, can you talk about how we can improve those
Sure.
parks?
Yeah. A couple of things. First, Moses has been vilified primarily through the power broker book. He's not only is he not nearly as bad as he's made out to be by Robert Caro, but his work for parks was outstanding. He tripled the park system in size. No one's come close to his accomplishment. They went. There was a 600-fold increase in playgrounds. They went from 100 playgrounds to 600 virtually overnight. He built Orchard Beach. He made all the private beaches public. He built Eastern River Park. He built Marine Park at 800. The biggest park in Brooklyn was created by Robert Moses. Orchard Beach and Pelham Bay Park. So an extraordinary park builder. He's criticized. Here comes one of those lousy helicopters. That's a helicopter coming from the Hamptons, taking wealthy folks to Manhattan. It's going to be very loud.
That's his route.
Yeah, we've got one route going from Manhattan to JFK down Eastern Park, and another coming up Flatbush Avenue. And they're extremely loud. They're Sikorsky helicopters.
I've never been in a helicopter.
It's a very bad thing for New York City. Anyway.
LA, I'm from LA. There's lots of helicopters.
Yeah, but LA, they're mostly police and news. These are all wealthy people for convenience flights and tourists.
Yeah,
so, anyway, off that soapbox. So, but also he was a highway builder. He was a housing builder. He was a bridge builder. So when he had extra pieces of land next to highways and bridges, he turned them into playgrounds. And those are probably not great. They're, as you say, largely asphalt. There's kind of leftover pieces. They're right next to very highly polluted areas. The urge to turn every available piece of open space into a park was a good one, but they were not great spaces to begin with. So this administration, currently in office, Mayor Adams, Mayor de Blasio, did a lot of retrofitting of old Moses-era parks and playgrounds to make them less asphalt and more green. And that's a very important thing, so that when you had opportunities for tabula rasa, it is a big open space that never had anything on it, to make a new park. So that would include Brooklyn Bridge Park, Hudson River Park, and others, Fresh Kills, and what we call Gas Tanks Park. That was extremely unusual. In my experience as Parks Commissioner, we never had an opportunity quite like the Elmhurst Tanks area, because it was tabula rasa. You were starting literally from scratch. They turned over a post-industrial site and said, make a park. So we had to reimagine that site as a park. And given the community, the Elmhurst community had very few parks, how do you make it as green as possible and make it sustainable? That was the challenge. And it was a very challenging site right next to the LIE, in a busy working class community. What could we do to create a park that provided the most environmental benefits, but also served the recreational needs of the local community? So it was a major challenge to conceiving that park.
I think the big difference between Moses and Elmhurst gas tanks and maybe your administration is you talked to the community. The community was involved. The community, Juniper Park Civic Association,
Yes.
to other people were involved in the battle to make that a park.
Yeah.
So can you talk about that community and when you first heard about that community and what was happening?
Yeah, when Keyspan first reached out to us, and I remember the time when the conversation started, where people started saying, Keyspan may be willing to donate this property to the city, this property which is worth tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars, which could have been developed. And they were willing to donate it to the city. And that was a huge opportunity, and we're thrilled. But we also understood that whatever it is we were going to do, there had to have the support of and the buy-in from the community. So the Parks Department might have some ideas, and some other people might have some ideas. The inclination in many communities is, put in a bunch of ball fields, right? We have a new park. And we could have done that. We could have brought it all up to flat grade and made it just into one big series of ball fields, as has been done in other places. But even though there was a crying need for more ball fields in that community, we thought, if we just make this ball fields, it will only have one single point of use, which is athletes and probably sports leagues, and nobody else would get to use it. So while we wanted to accommodate some sports use, we also wanted to make it like a mini Central Park, a place of passive beauty, of passive recreation. And what you find in survey after survey is the biggest use of city parks is not for active sports, it's for passive recreation. sitting, walking, strolling, reading, picnicking, letting your kids just run around. Even in Central Park, which has tons of ball fields, that's not the main use. The main use is passive recreation. So we were, maybe naively trying to create a mini Central Park in the middle of residential post-industrial Queens.
A park, has to serve, like, I think talking about Jane Jacobs again, like, a diverse group of the population. And I've been to Elmhurst Park a few times now, and there's a lot of old people, like, serving, Chinese or Korean descent, like, walking around and very active. And, like, I was amazed. I was like, if I'm 75, I want to be as active as these people. It's really inspiring. Like, but there's kids, there's everybody using that park, and like you don't see a lot of parks anymore.
Well, it was also an evolving neighborhood. So you had what used to be mostly Central and Eastern Europeans. A lot of that area used to be primarily German and Irish. Was evolving to other groups, other nationalities. People from the Far East and Near East. It was an incredibly diverse and polyglot community. So it would have been very difficult to say, let's consult just this group and have their opinions. I'll tell you an interesting anecdote of just that, of changing New York. In Corona, there was a park with some basketball courts. A neighborhood that had been primarily Italian. But Mexicans and Central Americans were moving in, and they decided that what they really wanted to do was play three-man volleyball on the basketball courts. And when we were planning the renovation of the space, we said, what if we put in purpose-made volleyball courts for the Mexican kind of three-man volleyball? And the Italians still had hold of the community board, and they were, no. We want basketball courts, and we want bocce courts, and we don't want stuff for Mexicans. So, it's a very tricky dance city officials play when saying, who is the community? Is it the people who have been dominating the community board for many years, but have become more of a minority? So it's, you never knew if you were right. And there was no magic formula. And you often thought, like, well, if you try to accommodate too many people, it will be a mishmash. So it was pretty, we took a calculated gamble that most people would appreciate having a lot of passive use space, green lawns, trees, benches, things to do that are not a specific sport. The problem when you have a specific sport, like bocce, is when people no longer play bocce. You've got these, New York City is littered with former bocce courts.
Bocce, handball, nobody plays.
They used to be Italian, and the Italians all moved. So, we even tried at the Parks Department to revive bocce, and it became kind of a yuppie thing. A little bit, but never fully. And then, we sponsored handball. Now, interestingly, handball has stayed put. Like, the new immigrants all play handball, the Chinese, the East Asians. So, handball is still king in Southern Brooklyn, Coney Island, Queens. But bocce, is pretty much affiliated with Italians. And I can point out to you a lot of former bocce courts or places where there used to be bocce courts that were built by Moses at a time when these neighborhoods were principally Italian.
Can you talk a little bit about the design of the Elmhurst Park, and like how does that work? It seems to me in my research it goes in stages. Where you start with some plantings and then you build out like the landscape.
Well, the big trick with Elmhurst was to both respect and improve the topography. So you had several big issues. One is a pretty steep change in grade. Two, the highway, which was a major source of noise and air pollution. So could you figure out, like, can you buffer the highway with landscape forms? Do you want to have some hills, so maybe in an area which is pretty flat, kids could go sledding in the winter? Having a hilly area by its very nature would prevent it from becoming just a sports field. But having some active recreation, and again, here I'm a little bit hazy, I can't remember. I think we ended up with a basketball court there. I don't think we ended up with any formal playing fields. Is that true?
No, there's no basketball court, but there's like a oval, a circular kind of like soccer.
Some kind of a sports oval. We did some kind of a sports oval
If
for
we
active
play
sports,
soccer.
so we didn't do basketball. And we also looked around, saying there were other parks right adjacent nearby that had baseball and football fields and basketball courts just a few blocks away, adjacent, Moses Era Park's adjacent to the LIE. So we said, maybe not so important that we do heavy sports use things here because you've got some right nearby. Also, like it wasn't too far to Flushing Meadows Park, which is full of sports fields.
And like the landscape architecture design of that, like, is that like internal parks department or are there different groups involved?
As I recall, the design was done by a Parks Department landscape architect, and you can check that. I don't think we had. So when parks are designed in the Parks Department, they're designed either by New York City landscape architects who work for the Parks Department, or by consultant landscape architects. And at the time, and I think it's still the case, there was a rotation list of professional landscape architecture firms who are pre-qualified to design parks and recreational facilities, and then they have like mini bids to see who gets what job. So I'm afraid I can't recall, but my belief is that it was designed in-house.
And then the idea, like, the Cats wanted the memorial, and then can you talk about, like, that was towards the end of your tenure, I guess, when the memorial was built?
Yeah, I think that happened after my time. I think because I left in September of 2012. Is that right? 2012. That's right, because the last year was 2013. So I left with a year and a quarter to go. I think the war memorial aspect entered the picture sort of after the fact. But, there's always been a desire to memorialize people and things and causes in parks. 9/11 led to a whole series of small neighborhood-based memorials for 9/11. There are hundreds of war memorials around New York City. You can go through Brooklyn and Queens and find World War I memorials, World War II memorials. There's at least one major Korean War memorial. There's a Vietnam War memorial in Lower Manhattan. And then there are small sort of individual parks named for people who fought and died or earned bronze or purple stars or whatever, gold stars, fighting in various wars. So New York City is full of commemorative places. And I think it's one of those things where you don't want all the parks to become cemeteries. And even Frederick Law Olmsted fought this battle. People wanted to fill Central Park with memorials to people who were famous at the time. And he said, this is a park, not a cemetery. We're not going to fill it. So he fought a pitched battle against too many monuments. He didn't win all, but he won most. There's not that many statues or memorials in Central Park. In fact, the first figurative statue to go into Central Park in 60 years or more was this statue of the suffragists memorial. Was the first actual new statue to go into Central Park in more than 60 years. Because there had been a very careful thing, like no more new statues in Central Park since about the 1940s.
And why are parks so important to the city of New York?
I grew up in New York City, and I lived in small apartments all my life. I still do. I live in a one-bedroom apartment in Manhattan. Most of us don't have front yards and backyards. For most of us, the parks, neighborhood parks, are the front yards and backyards. They're the place where we get exercise, where we go for peace and quiet, where we go to sit and read the newspaper, read our phone, where we go on dates, assignations, where we have our first kiss, our first date, where you might have a Holy Communion, a birthday party, a bar bat mitzvah, a wedding, memorial services. They kind of play the role of secular churches. They're gathering places in times of great sadness and great happiness. I still remember two big occasions. One was immediately after John Lennon was murdered in front of his house. Everybody went and gathered in Central Park, like thousands of people, because he lived nearby. And then 9/11, while the smoke was still coming from Lower Manhattan, people were gathering on the Sheep Meadow, like to be together with their loved ones. So parks play an outsized role in New York City, greater than most cities, because of the fact that we're so densely packed in, and none of us have front yards or backyards. And it's parks in New York City define quality of life. New York City would simply be unlivable and undesirable without a great park system. And mostly people have understood this and been willing to invest.
And do you think, like, talk investment, there's a Play Fair initiative to get the city to give more money to parks. What is I mean, obviously, more money for parks is good, but what is your opinion about that? Do you think like that's a realistic thing to get 1% from the budget for a park?
Yeah, so the question is about 1% for parks. Is that a viable goal? Yes, it is and has been for a long time. I supported it when I was commissioner. My predecessor Henry Stern supported it. To put that in context, currently the Parks Department gets about half of 1%, which is better than it's been in the past. Mayor Adams gave it a nice big boost of $50 or $100 million in the last budget. There is a bit of a myth going around that New York City parks are dramatically underfunded. That's not true. I spent 8 years working for the Trust for Public Land after working at New York City Parks, which is a national organization for parks, advocacy group for parks, that publishes something called Park Score every year, which analyzes which cities have the best park systems. And New York City is consistently in the top 10, has been as high as 3 or 4. And part of that analysis is based on how much money is spent per capita. And New York City is way up there in expenditures per capita, and that's one measure of park quality. There are most cities in America do not spend as much per resident as we do. A few spend more. Washington, D.C., that's a bit of an outlier because they get a lot of federal money. Half the parks there are federal. Seattle, maybe Portland, San Francisco, but that's about it. New York City is way up there. Now, we could still do much better, and if they had 1%, you would have a gardener for every neighborhood, for every park district, which would be really important. You're seeing a lot of weeds growing now, so they need to hire at least 100 more gardeners. They need more skilled maintenance people to do the skilled trades work to fix water fountains and electrical systems that go out. Even with all the capital dollars they're spending, which is probably close to $500 million a year, this is an old park system. It goes back to the 1850s in some cases. It needs constant restoration. So I believe getting 1% of the city's budget to parks is not just believable or practical. I think it's kind of a necessity. And it's also a rounding error in the city's budget. The city's budget is $100 billion. So what we're talking about is $1 billion for 14% of the city's land mass, right? And for something that's used by all 8.5 million of us, and is a key to a livable city, it's a key to our resilience. To the extent we can deal with the impacts of climate change, it's because we have big, beautiful trees all over, absorbing carbon, providing shade. Parks are not luxuries in New York City, they're absolute necessities. The presence of parks drives down crime. It's well documented in studies that the presence of parks drives up real estate values. They're absolutely crucial to our physical, mental, and environmental health. There's no such thing as a great city without a great park system. When you look at the rankings of what make great cities to live in America, all of them are in the top rankings in Park Score in terms of how well they do in parks. And the cities that spend the least on parks are kind of in the South and the Southwest, in Texas and in places in Southern California and Alabama and Georgia. And it shows. The parks are terrible, nobody goes to them. New York City could do a lot better, but it's pretty good. People should not quite believe the hype that things are terrible. Things are pretty good, but they could be better.
And let's talk about maybe the last question.
Yeah.
So you had the battle to build Continuum, whatever it was called. That's complete now. There's no, because there was a battle to they were going to build
the fight for sunlight. Yeah. So from where I'm sitting, just a little bit to the east and south, was a site at 960 Franklin Avenue in Crown Heights, where there's a proposal to bust through the existing zoning and build 2 gigantic 40-story towers that would have been the tallest buildings in central Brooklyn. And they would have cast a shadow that goes all the way across the garden into Prospect Park in the late afternoon. In the morning, early morning. But worse, there would have been a 2 or 3 hour shadow on the conservatory complex. So they would have stolen vital sunlight from our most important plant growing area. Fortunately, that required approval by the City Planning Commission and the whole public hearing process known as ULURP. And at every step of the public hearings, the public came out and spoke in a loud and unified voice. The 60,000 people who signed our petition, the most people to ever sign a petition ever on a city planning issue. The then borough president, Eric Adams, coming out against the project, the local council member, Lori Cumbo, coming out against the project. the city planning commission saying at the public hearing to the applicant, you know we're not going to approve this. Why are you even trying? And then Mayor de Blasio himself saying we're against this project. So we were able to defeat it. No towers, no shadows. But there's always another fight to fight. You never know when someone's going to try that again. We hopefully they will have learned from the big losses the developer took. And so the current zoning, which is for 6-story buildings, still applies.
Do you think? Well, I mean, you have Prospect Park right there. That site's never going to become a park, or is there a push for that?
Prospect Park. The good news about parks in New York City is they're protected by something called the public trust doctrine and parkland alienation. You can't build a tower in a park unless you go through 3 levels of legal process. 1 is the city council approves it, 2, the state legislature approves it, 3, the governor signs off on it, and 4, most important, you replace the parkland you've taken away with park of equal size or value. So if you were going to
what about a continuum? Like, with that's still going to become apartments, or like that's never.
So private property doesn't have the same rules on it. Private property is only governed by the existing zoning. In this particular site, the existing zoning says 6-story buildings. So the developer there can build 6 or 7-story buildings, and that's what we think they're actually going to do.
And I was just wondering if you had anything else that you wanted to say about parks, or what you recall about Elmhurst Park, or your time
Sure.
as park commissioner,
Yeah.
or parks in general.
I think about in my 27 year at the Parks Department, every once in a while a terrific opportunity presents itself. And the opportunity to build a 6-acre park from scratch does not happen very often. It's like being able to build a new Washington Square, Union Square, Madison Square, in a place that never had a park before. 95% of our capital work in parks was rebuilding existing parks. The opportunity to add a new park doesn't come along very often. But it did for what we call Gas Tanks Park, for Hudson River Park, for Brooklyn Bridge Park, where we took old post-industrial sites and turned them into parks. And so, of all the things I was involved with, perhaps among the most gratifying was the idea that you could add new parks, which is a huge expense, and that we had the commitment of mayors and others to say, yes, it's going to be hundreds of millions of dollars. But the thing I've learned is no one looks back now and says, weren't they foolish to take 800 acres of valuable real estate in Manhattan and turn it into Central Park? No one says that. And no one's going to look back and say, they really should have built condos instead of that park in Elmhurst. Or why did they waste all that money building that park? Now we look back and say, wasn't that a bargain? And how great that Keyspan made that great civic donation. The city had the great sense to create a beautiful park, a mini Central Park, for that very needy neighborhood.
I mean, I think we're good. I'm done, dude.
I'm good.